Starting with the generation that was born in the mid-20s to the mid-40s, some people call it the mature, some call it the greatest generation, some call it the silent generation. There's a lot of different names. But this is the group that grew up during the Great Depression. And so they had a great appreciation for having a job, any job, and the ability to work was something they were thankful for. This is also the group that went to World War II. And so they were very patriotic, they were very hierarchical, they understood the importance of following orders and that people's safety depended on it. So a very conservative generation, fiscally and socially. The next generation was the baby boomers. This is a generation that came in a time of prosperity, and so they didn't have the same anxiety that their parents did about work, and they enjoyed just a happier life. That's when rock and roll came around, but they also went through things like Vietnam and Watergate, where they started to really question authority and push back and not just take for granted that they need to do as they were told. Generation X was the MTV generation. You know, I want my MTV. They were also the generation that first got to experience the internet. They were the generation that first experienced video games. And so they were kind of on the leading edge of technology, but they weren't fully into it like later generations. It's a smaller generation. They were the people born mid-60s through late 70s. They were also a generation that was very focused on work-life balance. The Family Medical Leave Act was shaping legislation for this generation. They were more likely to delay childbirth until after their careers were established. They were more likely to have smaller families. Gen Y, also known as the millennials, was the generation that came after Generation X. This is a generation that was much more engaged in technology than their parents were because they were born with the internet. As far as they knew, you'd always been able to find the answers right there whenever you wanted it. And so this is a generation that was used to having instant answers to questions. But Gen Y was raised by these very involved parents, and so when they went into the workforce, they were used to being very engaged with their leaders, and they wanted to have regular conversations with their managers. They wanted to work in teams. They wanted to get a lot of feedback, whereas the boomers didn't necessarily want to hear if they were doing something wrong, and the matures before them just did what you told them. Millennials were much more likely to say, let's have a discussion about this. How can we do a good job? How can we do better? How can I help, and how can I make things better? Now we have Gen Z in college, and they're starting to graduate, and they're very different from the millennials. So where the millennials really wanted a lot of engagement and interaction with their managers, they wanted everything to be set up so there was a lot of feedback, a lot of collaboration. Gen Z is much more independent. They're used to finding their own solutions. They're used to getting things done without involving a lot of other people. And as a result, we're seeing challenges when they go into the workforce with managers that are used to managing millennials, assuming that the Gen Z is going to come to them and include them when they have questions or when they try something new. Instead, what we're finding is they'll give a problem to a Gen Z person, and the Gen Z person will wander off and work on the problem. And yes, they're going to come up with some ideas that just show they don't know the industry very well yet. But don't squash those ideas, because you still want that energy, because every now and then they're going to see things you never dreamed of, because the world they grew up in is so different. And the world they grew up in is the world the rest of us are moving into. They just got there first and they're better at it. Part of why I started doing this research was because our companies were really struggling with how do we effectively manage young people, and noticing these trends and behaviors that seem to be coming in clumps over generations. So we've been giving free copies of my book to employers, which has been helpful, and also just talking to them. We've met with and spoken to a lot of employers about, all right, here's some of the best practices we're seeing. And if they say we're having this challenge, we'll say this is what we're seeing out there that's working with it. And so having some data to back that up rather than just impressions has been useful, because as you know, there's a lot of ugly things being said about young people in the workplace, a lot of really ugly stuff. And if you want to say bad things about a generation, it's easy enough to find 4 or 5 people that are irritating to you so that you can attack an entire generation. But it's better to have large numbers to say, hey, most people want to do a good job when they come to work. I don't know anyone that wakes up in the morning saying, gee, I hope I do a really bad job today. So if they're not doing well at work, then it's usually a communication or training issue that can be addressed, or it's a hiring issue that you didn't hire the right people. It's not just because they were born in the wrong year.